Comrade President, colleague heads of state and government, I'm very happy that this meeting was called for us to discuss a very complicated situation generally and to see what specific actions we can take together in making the lives of our people much better, our lives, our living and production much better. Now, if I begin by making some general preliminary comments, it is not the first time that we have seen historically that monopoly capitalism has expressed its contradictions through national factions. We are seeing now an outpouring of nationalist dimensions, even populist dimensions of the contradictions in monopoly capitalism. It is reflected in the MAGA movement in the United States of America, and specifically, it is manifesting itself through the impositions of tariffs and responses by governments to the impositions of tariffs. What we are seeing here will create further instability and contradictions in the global economy. And it is not going to be very easy for us in the developing world to cope with the knock-on effects of the contradictions of the nationalist factions of monopoly capital. Now, we have had, since the rise of modern globalization, we have had undercurrents of a reaction against a uniform global monopoly capitalism and the failures of that unified global capitalism. In fact, the impossibility of having it coherent has brought about very sharply these nationalist factions, as for example, in the MAGA movement, but we see it to a greater or lesser degree in every single country in the developed world. Now, the tariffs are going to create an increase in the price of commodities and services which we consume, which we import from these various countries. And it is going to make the situation more difficult for our own people. Pressures are going to be put on currencies, and we may well see that the knock-on effects would lead to lots of instability in the periphery of the global capitalist framework, the periphery meaning the hinterlands, those occupying the space of developing countries. Now, explicitly, part of that nationalist bundle of contradictions is made manifest too in an enhanced nativism and for the removal of certain categories of migrants. It's all part and parcel of the same process of the broad set of contradictions. Now, what is to be our reaction to the subject of migration as it is on our agenda? The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines has spoken publicly already, and we have made essentially 4 points on this issue from our own perspective. The first is that juridically, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines is obliged to receive any national of our country who is deported or repatriated from, say, the United States of America or any other country from which they are deported or repatriated. And once that is done in accordance with that country's internal legal processes and consistent with international law. So if then any of our nationals is to be sent to St. Vincent and the Grenadines from the United States, repatriated, deported, we will receive them, and we are obliged to receive them. But those processes must be consistent with international law. In other words, you can't have domestic legal processes which do not meet certain minimum standards of international law. And we accept that in the United States of America, those internal legal processes meet the minimum standards of international law. The second is that the sending state, in this case, the United States of America, is obliged to ensure that any national of St. Vincent and the Grenadines who is being deported or repatriated be accorded all the elemental rights. And even if you have your processes completely legal in accordance with international law, when you're deporting them, or when you're holding them for deportation or repatriation, you have to do it in a manner, and the United States of America would be required to do it in a manner which is not oppressive, where humanitarian law, international humanitarian law is embraced. And thirdly, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines expects that any sending state which is deporting or repatriating any of our nationals to provide to us all relevant information, including the antecedents touching and concerning that person's prior criminal conduct. Lots of the deportees are not going to be criminals, but a significant number of them are likely to be persons who have left St. Vincent and the Grenadines when they were small, when they were children, Some would have left there 30 years ago, left here 30 years ago, and they may now be in their 40s or 50s. What has been happening, and we in the Caribbean community have been asking that the countries, whether it's Canada, whether it's the US, whether it's Britain, anybody, any country which is deporting or repatriating our nationals, look, we need to know their background. We need to know their biography. Not because somebody was charged for burglary and you send them home after they have been found guilty for burglary, that you don't tell me what they've done before. They might have robbed before. They might have killed before. They might have committed fraudulent offenses. We would like to know so that we can be on the alert. And I think that's a reasonable request for our countries to be making. And the fourth point is that as far as is practicable, it would be helpful if the sending country would consider favorably any material assistance to facilitate the reintegration of deportees or persons who have been repatriated, particularly persons who have been in say, the United States or Canada or Britain for a prolonged period of time. I think if we are just calm and patient in relation to these particular principles and their application, that we ought very sensibly to work with those authorities from those countries which are deporting or repatriating. Because if we deport or repatriate anybody from our country, I would expect that we'd apply the same set of principles. Now, so the two nativist or nationalist dimensions are those connected to these tariffs and the ramping up of the deportation or repatriation. If those were the only two dimensions of the political response of, or the policy responses of this nationalist or nativist wing of monopoly capitalism, things would be difficult, but not crippling. Where we have what happens, and historically we have seen this, when you have actions like the deportations and the actions like the tariffs, it has been historically been associated with bullying of countries which are smaller, which are weaker, which are militarily way inferior, and which do not have the economic strength. And that is a dimension that we have seen already being used in the current period, but it is also a historical phenomenon which we have witnessed. Of course, as in the physical sciences, when you have an action, you're going to have a reaction. And already we have seen a reaction across the world. But the reaction across the world at the moment has been disorganized. The response has been inchoate and there has not been a coherence to the response. And the responses, of course, would vary. Canadians would want a different kind of a deal or settlement with the Americans. So too the Europeans. The Chinese would wish a different one. But in the midst of all these things, the nativist wing of the capital, of monopoly capital, would want to settle some scores, and they may want to settle them against places like Cuba, Venezuela, or the Latin American and Caribbean countries, African countries. How do we resist all of this? We have to be very clear-sighted, and we have to work together more closely and ramp up things which we should have been doing together more and have not been doing them. And I heard Nicholas spoke to the question of the actual matter of the air transport and marine transport for us to get that more coordinated and better. We need also to make linkages in those countries with our nationals and with other groups who would want to work with us, including persons, including persons who are monopoly capitalists, but who do not necessarily have this nativist outlook, and to work with people, ordinary people, working people, reliable people who have a basic decency about them. Again, historically, we have seen that. I don't accept that at the moment that what we are seeing in the United States has degenerated to fascism. I see it is an escalation of nativism, because we have seen that the courts, the level of the courts are doing certain things. People are using their rights, certain rights under the Constitution. And that's the stage where we are. That may well change, but that's the stage at which we are. But that has to be monitored very closely. We have to not exaggerate the threat, but we must never underestimate it, and we must have a realistic assessment. Now, we have the ALBA project. We need to accelerate that, but we have to accelerate that in tandem with the marine transport, the sea transport, as we build also with the air transport. Now, it has always been part of ALBA's quest to strengthen our cooperation on applied science and technology. And while it is important for us to have institutions which can help to coordinate our work. In fact, 2 years ago in Cuba, less than 2 years ago in Cuba, there was a conference at the non-aligned summit. There was a non-aligned summit dealing precisely with this question. And it is an item on the agenda for CELAC and also for us, the question of the use of applied science and technology. And apart from the issues of taking advantage of the research which is available and the technologies which are available, something which we are very sadly lacking in my view. It's better in some of our members than in others. But in our educational system, even when we are teaching applied science and technology, we seem to be teaching applied science and technology in relation to yesterday as distinct from tomorrow and the future. And we may well be training our young people insufficiently in the area of cutting edge science and technology. And I see that this issue has come up again, and specifically on the agenda in respect of artificial intelligence. But we come back to things which we know as to what our response is. We have to be in solidarity with one another, cooperate meaningfully on specific actions, and to hold aloft in our work the fundamental tenets which are laid down in the Charter of the United Nations, defense of our sovereignty and of our independence. And always to work as best as we can through the multilateral system and promote that. And to go for peace rather than war. And we have to make sure that all the institutions, all the regional institutions to which we belong, including ALBA and CELAC, among others, of course, CARICOM and the OECS, that we work in a more coordinated way. This is going to require careful thinking, practical application of matters which are achievable, and we have to build as far as is practically, as far as it is practicable within our domestic societies, a consensus as to how we should do our work. It's a difficult and complicated time. And we may well be looking at modern manifestations of the unfolding of social and political and economic phenomena reminiscent of the 1930s. We cannot underestimate what is happening. We must not overestimate, but the signs are not good. But we must never be pessimistic, nor never permit ourselves to be enveloped in learned helplessness. We have to build those alliances in this complicated world, and to do so sometimes with fresh thinking, which would take us away from old modes of operation. And I think we should have more of these conversations for ALBA-TCP by Zoom. We should have more frequent ones so that we can keep in touch and to better give the political push to many things which we have agreed upon. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a nuestro gurú.
Well, thank you very much to our guru, our guide, Ralph Gonsalves, the great Ralph Gonsalves. And of course, we have written down all of your guidelines